In August 2014, Andrew Blake, a 42-year-old civil engineer from Portland, Oregon, set out alone on what was meant to be a simple 5-day trek through the Hoh River Valley in Olympic National Park. Friends described him as careful, calm, and seasoned, a man who always returned with stories, never excuses. When he failed to come home that Friday, concern turned quickly to panic. Within hours, helicopters were circling the valley and rescue teams combed the forest, expecting to find an injured hiker, not a mystery. But on the third day, searchers stumbled upon Andrew's campsite perfectly tidy, eerily untouched. His tent was folded, his stove still set, his dinner uneaten. No footprints, no struggle, no Andrew. It looked as if he had simply stood up one morning and walked out of existence. From that moment, his disappearance would haunt everyone who entered those woods. Andrew Blake was the sort of man who seemed born for the wilderness. A civil engineer, by profession, precision, and planning, came naturally to him. Friends often joked that his rucksack was packed like a military kit, every tool, every meal, every route carefully measured and checked twice. He had spent years exploring the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest, always returning with a quiet smile and a camera full of misty valleys, cold rivers, and towering pines. To those who knew him, Andrew wasn't reckless or impulsive. He was methodical, disciplined, and deeply respectful of nature's unpredictability. That was why, when he set off for Olympic National Park in August 2014, no one imagined it would be the last time they saw him. His plan was simple: 5 days alone in the Hoh River Valley, one of the park's most remote and beautiful regions. He would follow a well-known trail towards the foot of Mount Olympus, camp by the river, and return home by Friday evening. He left with enough food, a satellite phone, and a weatherproof tent. His wife, Catherine, watched him go with only the mild unease that comes from long goodbyes. He promised to call midweek. He never did. By Saturday morning, worry had become fear. When neither calls nor messages came, Catherine contacted the local authorities. Within hours, Olympic National Park's search and rescue teams were mobilized. Dozens of volunteers, rangers, and even helicopters joined the effort, scouring ridgelines and riverbeds. The weather was kind, clear skies, light winds, and everyone assumed they would find him quickly. A man like Andrew didn't just vanish. For 3 days, the search expanded, mile by mile, the helicopters tracing wide circles over the endless canopy. On the third day, one of the ground teams discovered what they believed would be the breakthrough: his campsite. But what they found there raised more questions than it answered. The tent, a high-end model built to withstand alpine storms, had been neatly folded and packed away into its compression sack. His sleeping bag was rolled tight beside it. The gas stove stood nearby, alongside a pot and a sealed bag of dehydrated food. It looked as if he had packed up calmly that morning, ready to move on, yet his boots, backpack, and satellite phone were missing. There was no sign of a struggle, no drag marks, no prints in the mud beyond a few near the stream that led nowhere. Even the trained search dogs lost his scent after just 50 meters, as if the man had simply evaporated. The rescuers, hardened to grim discoveries, were unsettled by how pristine everything appeared. Bears or cougars would have torn the tent apart. A fall or illness would have left some trace. But this was too clean, too deliberate. It was as if someone, or something, had tidied up after him. The official report would later suggest that Andrew had likely slipped into a river or crevasse, his body carried away by the current. But among those who searched for him, few truly believed that. There was something about that camp, its stillness, its order, that whispered of a different kind of disappearance, one that didn't follow the rules of accident or reason. And so, Andrew Blake's name joined the long list of hikers who had gone missing in America's wild places. But unlike most, his story would not fade quietly into the forest. It would resurface 9 years later when the rain came, and the earth finally decided to give him back. The camp was discovered just 20 meters from the main trail, tucked between 2 cedar trees beside a slow, glassy stream. At first glance, it looked as though it had been prepared for a photograph rather than left behind in the middle of a manhunt. Everything was perfectly arranged. The tent folded into its case, the sleeping bag rolled tight, the cooking pot rinsed and placed neatly beside a small gas stove. Even his food remained sealed and untouched. It didn't resemble the chaos of a hurried departure, nor the panic of an injured hiker trying to survive. It felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if someone had taken the time to erase any trace of struggle. Investigators and rescuers who arrived at the site exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen plenty of campsites abandoned in panic-torn tents, scattered supplies, the frantic footprints of people lost to fear or injury. But here, nothing suggested distress. The grass beneath the tent was still pressed flat, indicating it had been packed away only recently. His boots and rucksack were gone, but there were no footprints leading away from the clearing. Even the soil seemed undisturbed, except for a faint trail of compressed moss that ended abruptly on a patch of bare rock near the stream. When the search dogs were brought in, they caught Andrew's scent briefly, following it for about 50 meters before losing it entirely. The dogs circled, whined, and stopped, confused. One handler later said it was as if the scent just vanished into thin air. Theories multiplied quickly. Perhaps he had tried to cross the stream and fallen. Perhaps he'd wandered off trail and been injured. But none of it aligned with what they saw. A man meticulous enough to fold his tent before leaving would not have wandered into danger without reason. For days, helicopters scanned the valley with infrared cameras, hoping to spot a heat signature among the trees. Volunteers spread out across the ridgelines, calling his name, marking every gully and cave. Each day brought fewer leads and heavier silence. The forest swallowed the sound of rotors and voices alike. By the end of the second week, the optimism that had fueled the search began to thin into exhaustion. There were small, unsettling details that didn't make it into the official report. One volunteer claimed to have found a small pile of stones arranged beside the stream, too deliberate to be random, too simple to mean anything. Clear. Another ranger mentioned hearing strange noises at night, like faint metallic tapping carried by the wind. Each of these accounts was quietly dismissed. The focus, after all, was on facts, not folklore. When the search was finally called off, the conclusion was tidy and bureaucratic. The report cited probable accidental death due to environmental factors. The case was closed, and Andrew Blake was officially declared deceased. For the authorities, it was another tragedy in the wilderness, unfortunate but unremarkable. Yet those who had seen the campsite, who had stood in that clearing surrounded by unnatural quiet, carried away a different impression. Something about the scene felt staged, as though whatever had happened there was meant to conceal rather than reveal. The forest, ancient and indifferent, had swallowed its witness whole. And while the paperwork filed him under lost, those who had searched for him left knowing the truth was still out there somewhere beyond the trees, waiting to be found. 9 years passed before the forest gave up its secret. In the autumn of 2023, relentless storms battered the Olympic Peninsula. Weeks of rain triggered landslides across the park, tearing through slopes that had not been touched for centuries. When 2 park maintenance workers were sent to inspect a damaged trail near the Hoh River Valley, they noticed a dull metallic edge jutting out from the washed-out bank. At first, they thought it was an old storage drum or fuel container, just another relic left behind from the logging era. But as they scraped away the mud, they realized it was buried deliberately, a meter deep in compacted soil. The barrel was industrial-grade steel, heavy, sealed, tight with a screw clamp, the sort designed to keep its contents secure for years. It took 3 men and a winch to pull it free. When they finally prized open the lid, a wave of decay spilled into the damp air. The stench was overpowering, so thick that one of them vomited before stepping back. Inside lay scraps of clothing fused to bone, a tangle of fabric, hair, and something that had once been human. Wrapped tightly around the upper vertebrae was a length of rusted steel chain. The sight was so grotesque that the men stood in silence for nearly a minute before calling it in. The discovery spread through the local ranger station like wildfire. Within hours, the area was cordoned off, and forensic teams arrived from Seattle. The skeleton was transported to the state laboratory, where pathologists began the slow process of piecing together what was left. Early analysis suggested the remains belonged to a middle-aged man. A titanium pin in the femur, an uncommon surgical implant used in the mid-2000s, narrowed the possibilities dramatically. Cross-referencing hospital records, the investigators found a match. Andrew Blake had undergone a femoral pin procedure following a hiking accident in 2005. DNA testing confirmed what everyone suspected, but no one wanted to believe. After nearly a decade of uncertainty, Andrew Blake had been found. But the relief that might have come with closure was quickly replaced by disbelief, because nothing about the way his body had been discovered made sense. People don't bury themselves inside sealed steel drums. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide him and to make sure he was never found. As technicians examined the barrel, they discovered something even more disturbing. On the inner surface of the lid, where the metal had been shielded from soil and moisture, there were fingerprints perfectly preserved, as if pressed there yesterday. The prints were run through the national database, and within minutes a name appeared on the screen: Robert Hawkins. The revelation sent shockwaves through the department. Hawkins wasn't a stranger, he had been one of their own. A park ranger for nearly 15 years, he had taken part in the original search for Andrew Blake back in 2014. His personnel file revealed a past few had known about a conviction for kidnapping in the 1,990 seconds and 7 years served before his quiet move to Washington State. He lived less than 15 miles from the site where the barrel was found. When detectives knocked on his door, the man who opened it was gray-haired, hollow-eyed, and eerily calm. He denied everything, insisting he had no idea how his fingerprints could have ended up there. Yet, as he stood in the doorway, facing the officers who had once been his colleagues, there was something unreadable in his expression, neither fear nor guilt, but a strange, weary acceptance. As though he had always known this day would come, and that whatever truth lay buried beneath that hillside was far darker than anyone dared imagine. Robert Hawkins was 63 when police brought him in for questioning. Once a respected park ranger, he had the quiet, withdrawn air of a man used to solitude. He spoke little, his voice steady, eyes vacant. When asked about Andrew Blake, he nodded slowly, remembering the 2014 search. Yes, he had helped. Yes, he'd known the terrain. But no, he had never seen that man outside of a missing poster. The fingerprints? He couldn't explain them. Maybe he had handled the barrel years ago during inventory, perhaps. The detectives pressed him harder, but Hawkins remained calm, offering no cracks in his story. His lawyer insisted it was coincidence, that an old fingerprint on an old drum proved nothing. And technically, he was right. Without more, there was no charge to hold him on. For the Blake family, that answer was intolerable. Andrew's younger brother, David, couldn't let it rest. He had lived with the uncertainty for 9 years now. Finally, there was a name, a face, and still no justice. So he began his own investigation. A retired detective agreed to help him privately, a man with more patience than faith in bureaucracy. Together, they traced Hawkins's past, speaking with former rangers, local hunters, anyone who might have crossed paths with him. What they uncovered was not a trail of guilt, but something stranger, an obsession. Colleagues described Hawkins as competent, methodical, but unsettling. He worked alone, volunteered for remote patrols, and kept meticulous handwritten records of every disappearance in and around Olympic National Park cases stretching back 50 years. His maps were dotted with red pins, marking where hikers had vanished, where torn carcasses of deer or elk had been found. It was as though he had spent decades hunting for patterns invisible to others. One interview changed everything. An elderly hunter named Joseph, from the Quileute tribe whose reservation bordered the park, agreed to meet David and the detective. His hands trembled as he spoke, but his eyes were sharp. He remembered Hawkins well. Said he was a man who listened too closely to the forest. Then he told them something they didn't expect, a story that began long before Andrew Blake. Years earlier, Joseph and his son had been hunting near the Elwha River when they heard an unfamiliar sound. It wasn't the cry of a bear or the wind tearing through the trees. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate clicking and rasping, like stones grinding under pressure. Moments later, something emerged from the trees. Joseph struggled for words, calling it a shadow with form. It stood taller than any man, its limbs long and thin, its skin gray and raw-looking beneath patches of matted fur. The head was narrow, its mouth filled with needle-like teeth, and its movements were disturbingly human. They fled without firing a shot. A few days later, Joseph found tracks near the same spot, massive, indistinct, alongside the bootprints of a single man. When Hawkins's photograph appeared on the news after his arrest, Joseph recognized him instantly. He'd seen him walking those same woods, always alone, always watching. To Joseph, it was clear, Hawkins had known about the creature. Maybe he had been tracking it, or worse, protecting it. Forensic analysis added weight to the unease. Under the microscope, several of Andrew's bones bore parallel grooves, deep, uneven scratches, inconsistent with post-mortem animal activity. They looked like claw marks made by immense force. And that chain wound around his neck? It wasn't random. It was the kind used to secure large traps. The detective's theory was grim but coherent. Hawkins hadn't killed Andrew Blake. He had found him killed by something else, something the ranger had spent his life keeping hidden. To prevent panic, or perhaps to shield the creature itself, Hawkins had concealed the body inside the stolen barrel. The fingerprints were his because he had been the one to seal it. Not a murderer, but an accomplice to nature, or to something that lived beyond it. When investigators confronted Hawkins again, they spoke not as accusers, but as men seeking truth. And that, finally, broke something in him. He stared ahead, voice flat, and said only, "You don't understand. Some things should be left alone. I was keeping the balance." A week later, he hanged himself in his cell. He left no note, no confession, only silence. And in that silence, the questions grew darker. What balance had he been protecting? What had he seen in those woods that turned duty into obsession? No one could answer. The park closed the case, the file sealed, but those who had heard the story knew better. Something had lived in that forest, something older than the park itself, and Hawkins, in his own dreadful way, had been its keeper. When the news of Hawkins's death reached the press, it was presented as a tragic end to a troubled man's life, a closed chapter in a long and exhausting investigation. Officially, the case of Andrew Blake remained unsolved. The park authorities released a brief statement expressing sympathy for the families involved and quietly moved on. But for those who had followed the story, there was no sense of closure. Instead, there was a lingering unease, as if something vital had been deliberately left unspoken. Hawkins's final words echoed through every report and every discussion that followed. "I was keeping the balance." What did he mean by that? Some believed it was the rambling of a guilty mind, a man consumed by his own delusions. Others, particularly those who had spent time in those remote valleys, weren't so sure. They spoke of the silence that falls too quickly in the deep woods, of the strange echoing calls that seem to circle you in the fog. Perhaps Hawkins had seen something that no man should, and tried in his own way to contain it. In the years since, hikers still disappear in Olympic National Park. Not many, and never enough to make the news, but enough to keep the legend alive. And maybe that's the real truth here. Nature is not cruel or kind, only indifferent. It doesn't need to hide its secrets, we simply fail to see them. Some mysteries were never meant to be solved, some forests were never meant to be entered.